everyone, it's Mary Brownlee, licensed professional counselor and trauma therapist. Today we're going to talk about a topic that's near and dear to my heart since I happen to be an HSP. For those of you who are also HSPs, you might recognize it if, for example, you always felt like the oddball when you were growing up, kind of the person who was different. Maybe you got told you were really too sensitive a lot of the time, or overly emotional, or you just felt like super different from other people. And oftentimes those of us who are HSPs have a different way of looking at the world. So we're really deep thinkers, deep processors, and from very young ages as well. So I'm going to talk about the intersection of, if you are an HSP temperament, which by the way is, there are brain differences, and this is something we inherit. So it's not a disorder, it's not a diagnosis, it's something we actually inherit. So if you are an HSP and you've had lots of childhood trauma, this video will be really helpful for you, because in all actuality, trauma does impact those of us with this unique temperament a lot more deeply and potentially in kind of a higher trauma level than those maybe who don't fall into the HSP temperament category. So we'll talk about what an HSP temperament is. I'll go over a little quiz so you can tell if you are one, and then we'll talk about the intersection of trauma and how we heal trauma if we have this unique temperament. If you find this video, feel free to give me a like. It helps me to know what topics you guys are finding helpful. And without further ado, let's get started. So HSP stands for highly sensitive person. This term was first coined by Dr. Elaine Aron. So she is a psychologist and a researcher, and she has been studying this unique temperament as well as other psychological topics for quite some time. She has wonderful books out there as well, and I'll be linking her website below, especially her quiz, which I'll be going over later, so that you can go check her stuff out as well. But in the scientific literature, HSP is known as sensory processing sensitivity. So if you want to do more research on it, look up sensory processing sensitivity, because that's how it's known in the scientific literature. All right. And so what science has found is that this is an actual, it's not a disorder. It's not a diagnosis. So it's not like, for example, anxiety or depression or bipolar disorder, for example. This is something that just, they can actually tell through brain differences that our brains actually look different on functional MRI scans than somebody who doesn't have the HSP temperament. And it also is genetic, so we can inherit it from our parents and grandparents and so on. So it tends to run in families as well. And basically what this means is that you, if you are an HSP, are biologically hardwired to experience the world more deeply, including thinking and feeling very differently than other people, and thinking and feeling about the world and your environment and your experiences at a much deeper level. Interesting information about HSPs is that research has shown that about 20% of the population has this trait. So that means about 80% do not. So if you've ever felt like you're the odd man out and very different from others, which can feel very lonely and very isolating at times, well, in some ways you are, because this is a form of neurodivergence. We are literally different than about 80% of the population. So that does account for why you feel so different. And by the way, a lot of my clients, interestingly enough, have this unique trait and or autism or being on the spectrum in that way as well. So there's definitely quite a bit of overlap between autism and HSP traits in terms of what they look like. Now, they're two distinct autism is an actual developmental disorder. And again, HSP is not a disorder. So there are some differences, but how they show themselves and how individuals process, there is some similarities here. So I like to call it neurodivergence, because we literally diverge from the average person, both if you're autistic and if you are HSP, and ADHD is another form of neurodivergence as well. So we're kind of in that unique tribe of people that think about the world and operate in the world differently. It also is, people with HSP can be introverted or extroverted. I thought that was interesting. I would have thought it was introverts that were mostly HSPs, but actually you can be an extrovert as well and an HSP. For those that don't know, introverts are people who are more comfortable being on their own. They really don't like crowds. Lots of social stimulation is kind of exhausting for them, so they need more quiet time to withdraw. And then typically extroverts like crowds and being around lots of people and socializing, and that kind of energizes them, and they like that a bit more. So you can be both extroverted and or introverted and also an HSP. So that's kind of interesting too. And again, HSP is different from sensory processing disorder as well. So it's not autism, it's not ADHD, it's not sensory processing disorder. And Dr. Elaine Aron goes over in much better detail than I could do here on her website, and explains the differences between these for anybody who's curious and wants to know more. And what I also think is pretty cool is that those of us with HSP, there are some advantages to this trait. So it's not like you're broken or wrong or something's awful with, in terms of how you process the world and this is a weakness. Actually not. Those of us who are HSP oftentimes notice very small details very rapidly, and we pick up on small details a lot quicker and more easily than the average person. And you could see how that might have adaptations for our biology. For example, if 20% of the tribe was an HSP, maybe they were the ones that were more on alert. We're noticing small differences in the environment. We're noticing predators maybe, lurking that nobody else noticed. So there are some advantages to being very much somebody who notices information on a much deeper level. All right, so this comes straight again from Dr. Elaine's research. These are HSP traits with the acronym DOES. So the D stands for depth. So essentially, the processing of an HSP individual is much deeper and more thorough than someone else. The O stands for overstimulated. So essentially, those of us who are HSP, we do get overstimulated much more easily than somebody who does not have this temperament. So that's why we need more rest, more quiet time, withdrawing. Otherwise, it can be very stressful on our nervous systems. Emotional reactivity and empathy is much higher in those of us who are HSPs. So, the difficulty, I think, is that the emotional reactivity can be higher. So in other words, because we are feeling emotions much more deeply, you can imagine how things like sadness or anger or loneliness or even things like depression, for example, could be felt much deeper and thus much more distressing. And so those of us who have this trait sometimes have to work a little bit harder on things like emotion regulation as well, and learning coping skills to help us self-soothe. But hey, we're also higher in empathy. So we make great healers in the world in terms of we have great love for helping people, big hearts. We feel others' emotions and pain deeply as well. So we make great friends, great family members because we care so much and at a much higher level than the average person. So that's one of our biggest strengths. And then the S stands for subtle stimuli. And essentially that's what I was talking about. We have more awareness of very small and subtle details than the average person. So we're going to pick up a lot of things other people are not picking up, which again also makes sense why this is more exhausting, because you are picking up more information than the average person is picking up. So again, our nervous system does tend to get overstimulated more easily. All right, we're on to the fun part, the quiz. Many of you probably are excited to take this quiz. I know if you're like me and an HSP, You love exploring new information too and learning about yourself deeply, and that kind of gets us excited. So I have the quiz up. I'm going to read it. This is copyrighted, so I didn't want to show it here on my channel. So I'll just read it out loud. But again, I'll link it below. So you'll be able to go back and check mark each one after the video if you want to tally up your score. Or you can keep track while I read it. All right, ready? Here we go. All right, number 1, I am easily overwhelmed by strong sensory input. Number 2, I seem to be aware of subtleties in my environment. Number 3, other people's moods affect me. Number 4, I tend to be sensitive to pain. I find myself needing to withdraw during busy days into bed or into a darkened room or any place where I can have some privacy and relief from stimulation. I am particularly sensitive to the impact of caffeine. I am easily overwhelmed by things like bright lights, strong smells, coarse fabrics, or sirens close by. I have a rich, complex inner life. I am made uncomfortable by loud noises. I am deeply moved by the arts or music. My nervous system sometimes feels so frazzled that I just have to go be by myself and alone. I am super conscientious and thoughtful. I startle easily. I get rattled when I have a lot to do in a short amount of time. When people are uncomfortable in a physical environment, I tend to know what needs to be done to make them more comfortable. For example, like changing the lighting or seating, getting them a blanket. I am annoyed when people try to get me to do too many things at once, right? It's overwhelming for those of us who are HSPs. I try hard to avoid making mistakes and forgetting things. I make a point to avoid violent movies and TV shows. Those can be overstimulating to our nervous system. I become unpleasantly aroused when a lot is going on around me. So again, overstimulation, too much going on around you, it's going to be stressful. Let's see, being very hungry creates a strong reaction to me, disrupting my concentration or mood. So yeah, we get hangry easily. Changes in my life shake me up. We don't like change. Ooh, no. I notice and enjoy delicate or fine scents, tastes, sounds, works of art. I find it unpleasant to have a lot going on at once. I make it a high priority to arrange my life to avoid upsetting or overwhelming situations, right? How much do we avoid? Because we know it's going to be overwhelming or upsetting. Eesh. I am bothered by intense stimuli like loud noises or chaotic scenes. And the last one, when I must compete or be observed while performing a task, I become so nervous or shaky that I do much worse than I would otherwise. And actually, I was wrong. There's one more. So the last one is, when I was a child, my parents or teachers seemed to see me as sensitive or shy. So yeah, other people noticing that maybe you were sensitive or shy and pointing it out. So that's the last one. Okay, we're on to the part of the video where we talk about trauma and how that can impact those of us who have the HSP trait. All right, so I can remember as a trauma survivor as well, for those of you who don't know, I'm pretty open about it here on this channel, but I also am a trauma survivor. So I know a lot about what this feels like on the inside. When I was a kid, I can remember thinking about things like death and dying and the meaning of the universe, like at very young ages. So if you can relate to this and you were thinking about really deep topics, like probably kindergarten, I would imagine, I was thinking about things like this. I also really love like psychology and understanding human beings and why human beings do certain things, etc. I can remember, I think I was about like 10 or 11, and we went to a book fair, and I can remember finding a psychology textbook. It was a college textbook, actually. And I brought it home, and I just remember reading all the pages with just so much excitement and interest. So that kind of gives you an idea of kind of what an HSP temperament looks like for somebody, you know, just in general. So yeah, if any of you can relate to that, having kind of very unique interests and thinking about the world very deeply and having a big interest in how and why things work. and you can see how that is very similar to, say, people who are on the autism spectrum. So there's some similarities there. And also I can remember definitely like textures on my skin, like certain clothing was very scratchy or bothersome. Like even today, I can't have tags on my clothes. I cut them off. So yeah, we're more, again, our skin and sensations, for example, are felt more strongly. So they bother us. So that definitely, I had that as a child. I'm trying to think of some other ways that, definitely. I was bullied a lot as well as a child, actually. So I was different. And I think because I was different, I stood out from the rest of the kiddos. I was quiet. I was shy, not as social as the other kids. And I think I was probably more awkward as well. And so those of us who are HSP sometimes get bullied and picked on to a higher degree because we are kind of unusual and different than other kids. So that's kind of an unfortunate thing that can happen to us. And again, trauma, this is not helpful for those of us who already struggle with feeling different. But as far as the actual trauma component, so I did have a lot of, during my childhood, a lot of kind of chaotic screaming and yelling and neglect, like emotional neglect was pretty prevalent. But, most definitely, I think my father was the one that definitely had periods of violence towards one of my siblings and like screaming and yelling. So that was like really scary. And you can imagine somebody who's already an HSP, loud noises, screaming, yelling, chaos, potential violence going on, that hits our nervous system way more, highly distressing. It's going to be distressing regardless to any child, quite frankly. But those of us who have this unique HSP temperament, we're going to feel this pain and distress and fear a lot stronger than somebody who doesn't have, the HSP trait. So trauma is going to impact our nervous system deeper, unfortunately, and probably, if I had to guess, a higher degree of trauma symptoms. And I find it interesting too, as I've been a therapist, since 2015, and I will say like a huge portion of my clients actually are HSPs and or on the autism spectrum. And I find this fascinating. It gets me wondering if those of us, again, who have this unique temperament or neurodivergence are, because we are impacted more deeply, it does make me wonder if that's why there's a higher percentage of those of us going into therapy and seeking help and trying to heal ourselves, because it causes such a high degree of pain and distress. So yeah, just kind of an interesting thing that I've noticed over the years as well. We're on to the slides now on trauma. So as I mentioned, HSPs already feel things more deeply. So painful experiences are magnified. We're going to feel them and process them at a much deeper and more profound level than an average person. What I have noticed in all of my clients who are HSPs, as well as myself, and if any of you are familiar with IFS, this will make sense. But for those of you who are just for the first time hearing about IFS, please check out a lot of my other videos on IFS. I'll link them below. I didn't want to bog this video down with a bunch of information on IFS since I have so much else on my channel on it. But IFS stands for Internal Family Systems Therapy. There are exiles, which are the original wounds, things like shame and unworthiness, like those original painful spots that we get from our childhood triggers, per se. You could think of them as triggers. But then what's interesting is we develop protectors that try to protect us from the emotional pain, whether it's shame, unworthiness, loneliness, painful emotions, essentially. So your protectors are there. For example, you might have like people-pleasing protectors that try to keep you safe by keeping the abuser happy. You might have a protector that's fundamentally very angry and reacts with that strong fight response if your nervous system is threatened or safety is threatened. You might have protectors, for example, that numb through either disassociation or substance use. So that hopefully that gives you some idea of what I'm talking about here when I'm talking about protectors. And exiles are, again, those original wounds where we carry messages of like shame and unworthiness and deep sadness. So yeah, those of us who are HSP, all trauma survivors are going to develop strong protectors, but those of us who are HSPs have, I think, protectors that protect distressing emotions to a little bit higher degree. At least that's what I've observed. And especially things like shame and unworthiness are felt at such a much higher level for HSPs. That's just kind of been my observations as a therapist who utilizes IFS with my clients. We get a lot of parts related to like people pleasing and overthinking things, overanalyzing things, substance use to numb. Again, that emotional pain's really high, so substance use is not uncommon. And again, dealing with overwhelm is already difficult for anybody, quite frankly, with trauma. But I've definitely noticed it to a higher degree. So my traumatized clients who are HSPs have even more difficulty with feelings of overwhelm. And so again, those protectors are going to try to reduce overwhelm in all the unique ways they do. Again, disassociation, numbing, avoidance. So yeah, there's different coping strategies that we develop to shut out distress, and a lot of over controlling parts as well. I've noticed that as well with HSPs and trauma. So as I've mentioned in some of the other parts of this video, HSPs already feel that they're very different from other people. Not only is it an internal sense of knowing that we're different, but also in people's reaction to us. Again, because I think we are neurodivergent. I mentioned that only 20% of the human population roughly is an HSP, so the 80% are not. So we already feel different, and so that already can increase sense of shame and unworthiness and low self-worth. So you add that on top of having lots of trauma exposure, and you could just imagine how magnified like shame and low self-worth and self-hatred and unworthiness. So those are the big time wounds that we have to work at to a higher degree if we're somebody who is an HSP. Because we already feel like a failure, that we're not good enough. We got those messages from childhood. Oftentimes that's part of the trauma. Parents did not do a good job of communicating unconditional love and support. In fact, just the opposite. So that's going to combine to just magnify already the HSP experience with being different. Hyperarousal. So again, hyperarousal and hypervigilance, very common for trauma survivors because again, their nervous system was constantly under threat. Our safety was constantly threatened, whether it was emotional or physical safety, it was constantly threatened from the abuse and trauma that we experienced. So you're going to see a much higher degree of what we call hyperarousal. So again, that's the nervous system's response, that fight, flight, freeze, fawn. Those nervous system activation is already happening at a higher degree from trauma. But again, the intersection of somebody with HSP temperament, their nervous system already gets stressed more easily. So again, it just magnifies the risk from trauma to the individual who is an HSP. Oftentimes post-traumatic stress disorder, very common and to a much higher degree in individuals who are HSP. At least that's definitely what I've observed in myself in clients with similar temperaments. And also HSPs think about, meaning and purpose and like the world, and if you're spiritual or not, like why we're even here, those type of questions. So HSPs are already processing the world more deeply. So then you add again the intersection of trauma and our entire sense of why we're even on this planet and what is our purpose in life gets deeply, deeply disturbed from trauma. And again, a deeper disturbance than just an average person who's not an HSP. So you can see like higher rates of depression in HSPs, like suicidal type of ideation and suicidal suicide attempts, that potentially is higher as well in this group, again, because we're already deep thinkers, deep feelers, and process to a much deeper depth. So purpose and meaning really gets skewed for every single trauma survivor, but to a higher degree in those of us who are HSPs. All right, we're on to the part where we talk about healing trauma. And especially if you have this HSP temperament, are there some unique things that apply to us? And yes, there are. One of the big things that I think helped me was reframing my differences as strengths instead of weaknesses. If you're like me, it's very likely that your family of origin typecast you as like the too sensitive one, the one that was, fundamentally flawed, scapegoated, too emotional, the crazy one, for example. So that's very common. A lot of HSPs come into therapy feeling scapegoated and like there's something terribly wrong with them. Because again, we were definitely different from our family members, but then you add, the intersection of trauma. A lot of families with trauma don't exactly do a great job of appreciating differences in family members and healthy communication and unconditional love. So yeah, we come in with a big, strong wounds of like unworthiness and shame. So yeah, it's really reframing, like, normalizing the fact that our nervous system differences are not a flaw and that there's nothing wrong with being sensitive and emotional, and that we are actually amazing human beings and that our empathy is a great strength. And so, yeah, that's correcting those perceptions of ourselves, very important to our healing process so that we don't perceive ourselves anymore as broken or flawed in some way. I love the concept of increasing self-compassion for all the parts that are suffering. This is something I do with all my clients. We are not very good at being compassionate with ourselves. If we're trauma survivors, and HSPs definitely are not compassionate with the parts that we were told were weak. So that is something we work on a lot, is increasing self-compassion and gentleness towards the parts of us that are suffering. And as I always tell all my clients, never in the history of histories has criticism or self-hatred ever made anyone feel any better. So we're not going to be criticizing and bullying our inner parts anymore. So that's huge. That's important for us to unlearn some of those old habits. Again, I use IFS. It's all about healing those wounded parts and improving self-energy. And if you don't know, again, self-energy is that authentic part of us, like who we would have been without the trauma, right? So self, it has these wonderful traits of like compassion, feeling calm, very wise. It has courage to move through fear. It's a very kind of centered, calm, compassionate energy. It's like, again, it's our authentic self. It's who we are when parts are not running the show. So we really work on improving the person who's been through trauma, their sense of self, because sense of self is something all trauma survivors have deficits in due to the childhood trauma. I love the idea of finding a tribe of other neurodivergent individuals. The first thing I do with any HSP or somebody who's on the spectrum, for example, or autistic, is I tell them immediately that, oh my gosh, you have no idea. There are so many of us out there. I had no idea until I became a therapist how common we are. We're a lot more common than you think. And a lot of us end up in therapy probably because we are suffering to a higher degree than the average population. But there's actually a lot of us. So you're not alone. There's plenty of us out there, and there's nothing wrong with you. I also teach my clients ways of like self-soothing, especially working with the body. We know that trauma definitely impacts the body as well. So things that calm our nervous system's fight, flight, freeze response, things like yoga, exercise is huge for trauma survivors and helping to complete stress cycles in the body so that our trauma symptoms can go down. Breath work for any type of anxiety or panic symptoms is really helpful. Massage and body work, even like dancing and just moving the body more in general is really helpful for trauma survivors across the board. It's also important to pay attention to our needs. So a lot of times we don't come into therapy doing a great job of tuning into what we actually need to feel better and to calm ourselves. So we're going to learn new things of like, hey, pay attention to what our body's doing right now. Pay attention to what we're feeling. Are we feeling frazzled? Are we feeling like we need a break? And if so, giving ourselves permission to do this. You don't have to feel guilty because maybe you took a nap this afternoon or you decided to just do nothing on Saturday and just reset the nervous system. Like, that's good for you. So we start to learn what loving ourself means. And that means in taking good care of ourselves and listening to what our body and our hearts and our minds and our emotions need. And if we need rest, giving ourselves permission to rest, especially if you're an HSP. We need more rest than the average person, more sleep too than the average person. We're going to validate emotions. We're going to learn emotion regulation skills. Again, I teach all my clients, no emotion is a bad emotion. Emotions are just packets of information. They tell us what's safe, what's not safe. They kind of give us an intuitive idea of like what direction to head in, what feels right for us. So emotions are not bad in and of themselves. Certain behaviors can be inappropriate, but emotions are not bad in and of themselves. So that's an important thing they learn. And also, most importantly, transforming meaning. So every trauma survivor struggles with meaning and purpose. So this is something HSPs really love to delve into is, why am I even here? And so how has my story of my life transformed? You know, we come into therapy, the story of us is one of pain and not feeling like we belong anywhere, feeling like there's something deeply wrong with us, feeling unloved. So we come in with this very painful story. And so I love to help clients transform the story of who they are, from maybe somebody who's a trauma victim to somebody who's not only overcome trauma, but maybe even, later chapters in the story of them is, how can I give back? Or what can I bring into this world to make this world a better place? Or what really sparks joy and purpose and meaning in my life? And going and finding that. So these are just some of the things that I personally have found very helpful in my own journey. And I hope these tips will also be helpful for you. And again, if you liked my video, please leave a thumbs up. Feel free to comment. All of that helps my channel and also helps me to know if you found this information helpful. So I appreciate all of you, and I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye, everybody.